Right, back with you here on In Focus. A senior researcher is convinced that the upcoming general elections bring with it a potential coalition government at provincial and possibly national level. In an opinion piece published by Ground Up, Joe Bregman puts into perspective guidelines that might help coalitions to govern for the sake of stability and delivery of services, and also asks some pertinent questions about integrity and trust among political parties. Bregman joins us now for more details on his opinion piece. Good to have you. Thank you very much for your time. What's happening at the Nelson Mandela Bay? Others are looking at it and saying this is exactly what we are fearing will happen at provincial and national level. Not necessarily because coalitions are bad in their nature, but it's because the political culture in the country mixed with the coalition gives us this kind of instability.
Hi, thanks for having me. So just to put this in some context, coalitions aren't something new. We've had them in South Africa since the local government elections in the 1990s. The number of coalitions, though, in the last local government elections jumped from somewhere between 20 and 40 to now having more than 80 coalitions in municipalities. And you're right, there is this constant refrain of dysfunction, of poor service delivery, of government breakdown. But last year, SALGA, so it's the South African Local Government Association, they reported that of the 82 municipalities in coalition, 30 of them were said to be functioning poorly or dysfunctionally. So that means there are more than 50 that are actually providing services, serving their citizens, and doing what we would expect. And you're right, it's not always about passing more laws. It often has to do with the political culture, which is often win at all costs and not often not always servicing the public good.
So at local level, you're dealing with the kind of things that we're hearing: municipal managers, mayors, COOs, head of departments, and so on and so forth, and those dodgy appointments and where money is being channeled. What would that represent at a national and provincial level?
So that is obviously the concern, that these issues will be replicated. What local government does compared to provincial or national is very different. So local government is the way that most people actually experience government on the ground. It's basic service delivery, it's sanitation, it's electricity, it's refuse removal. So I think there's somewhat of a misconception around how that might reflect at provincial and national level. I think at local level it's often where, they say the rubber meets the road, and it's where things will be felt most intensely.
So we have a seat kind of situation, a seat allocation, proportional representation. It's now being debated in the courts and so on and so forth, how exactly it's going to work. How important are those seats going to be, and to what extent would a seat in the National Assembly or a seat in the provincial legislature have an impact in the decisions and in the policies, I suppose, that will be put in place?
Sorry, are you talking about if we have coalitions at those levels?
Yeah.
Okay. If we see coalitions emerge, and according to the polls, so we've been looking at 3 main polls that were all released around the last quarter of last year, that all have the ANC in the early to mid-40s nationally, and these same polls, they say that ANC might lose Gauteng and KZN to coalition governments. So if that does happen, any seat in the legislature, in the National Assembly, we might still have a situation where smaller parties are acting as kingmakers. It really depends on the performance of the parties.
So let's look at some of the proposals then that are under consideration to help us manage this particular situation, and things like a threshold on who wins a seat in a legislature or at the National Assembly level. How is that going to assist?
That's something which, as Margaret counts, we are actually pushing back against. We think the introduction of electoral thresholds is a closing down of our politics. So just to be very briefly, the introduction of a threshold and the number being touted by the ANC, by the DA, is 1 or 2%. If we had to have the 2019 elections this year and the same results, instead of the 14 parties in Parliament, there would only be 5. That's how many parties would be excluded. Parties would still be allowed to run, but in terms of representation, they would require a certain percent of the vote to actually get seats, and it would really diminish our space. So the rationale behind it is it would create greater stability, where there are less parties in legislatures, and it becomes easier to form a government. But there are also sort of enormous drawbacks and quite dangerous a road to go down.
Yeah. And the other one is, of course, a limit on motions of or no confidence, which is a refrain that we've been hearing also over and over again. I mean, we know what, for example, that would have done to a municipality like Nelson Mandela Bay, as well as the city of Johannesburg, where you have 4 or 5 mayors changing hands in a term.
I mean, it's something which has an appeal because it will stop this sort of incessant merry-go-round. But a problem with limiting motions of no confidence is that is one of the ways to actually, hold government to account. And if you can only limit it, and some of the proposals have a sort of a safety net, if there's obvious transgressions or laws are broken, then you can introduce it. But we think it might be open to interpretation as to what that constitutes. So on paper, it sounds like a good proposal, but I think, again, it could also take away power from representatives and from the people they are supposed to represent. Just to say very briefly, I think for us, what one of the most important proposals is political parties coming forward and making sure that their coalition agreements are on the table beforehand, so that the electorate knows exactly what their plans are and who they potentially plan to partner with.
So stability, of course, not the only issue at hand here, but also transparency and accountability, because even these coalition arrangements themselves are not quite transparent. We don't actually know until there is a dispute and a disagreement what actually one party promised the other.
Correct. And I think there's an over-reliance on this idea of stability. We know that politics can be messy and that there are often changes in personnel. But another issue related to coalitions and a proposal that we would support is around insulating the public service from changes in coalition government. So when you have, new mayors, new cabinets coming in and such, the people in the public service who are actually implementing government policy and doing things on a daily basis aren't, pushed away from their jobs, or those things aren't sort of creating divisions in the way that services are affected.
All right, Joe Bregman, appreciate your time. Thank you very much for coming on, senior researcher at My Vote Counts there.